morning, everybody. My name is Connor Flanagan. I'm the Assistant Director from the Southampton History Museum. Today we are joined by Scott Chaskey, a poet, farmer, and educator. For over 30 years, he has cultivated greens, garlic, potatoes, and 60 other crops from the Peconic Land Trust at Quail Hill Farm in Amagansett, one of the original CSAs in the country. A pioneer of the community-supported agricultural movement, he is a past president of the Northeast Organic Farming Association of New York and was honored as Farmer of the Year in 2013. Seedtime by Scott Chaskey has been called a celebration as well as a call to action, urging us to renew our role as citizens of nature, in Aldo Leopold's phrase, not as conquerors of it. For this presentation, Scott will also read from his work in progress, Soil and Spirit, to be published by Milkweed Editions in 2022. I'll now turn everything over to Scott. Please, everybody, watch and enjoy. If you do have any questions, please feel free to submit them, and we will answer any questions you might have at the end of today's talk.
Good morning to all of you. So my plan is to talk a little and to read from my last book, Seedtime, and as an introduction to reading a chapter from, or most of a chapter from, the book that I've been working on for the last year and a half or something like that. And then my favorite thing is really to have more of a discussion. So hopefully you have some questions after I read, and then we can all, I can answer those questions. We can have a conversation. But I'm going to start with reading from Seedtime, which has a subtitle on the history, husbandry, politics, and promise of seeds. And I'm going to read from the afterword at the very end of the book, because I thought this was the way to link into the new book that I'm writing now. And it starts with the chapter. The afterword starts with a poem that is set in Cornwall, which is the province on the southwest tip of England, where my wife Megan and I lived for 8 years in the decade of the 80s. And I've written about Cornwall a number of times, in both in Seedtime and in my previous book. So here's a little poem to start things off. First light rides rocking water, stone blooms brush by windrush on sky and the crackers. Herbs and bone illumine dark earth, where blue stars sleep under the candles of Alchemilla. I learned to turn the earth and to cultivate crops in the dark, fertile soil of the cliff meadows perched just above Merlin's Rock, where the interconnection between mineral, flowering plants, and man, far from an abstraction, could be immediately felt. Though these meadows had largely been abandoned by market gardeners, their careful stewardship, carried on for generations, was evident in the artful stone walls used for terracing, the hedges of privet and fuchsia planted to block the strong winds, and the thousands of daffodils and narcissi that blossomed along the pathways each spring. That gives you an idea of the landscape. Now I'm going to move forward in the afterword. Seeds, like words, behave like capricious and autonomous beings. So if we give them space to perform, perhaps we stand a chance to inherit their intelligence. This seems like a wiser choice to me, rather than to force our intelligence upon them. I began this book with an observation made by Carrie Fowler more than 20 years ago. We are in the midst of a mass extinction event in agriculture, and the trend that promotes monocultures and economic consolidation is only intensified in the ensuing years. In 1985, in his book, Altered Harvest, Jack Doyle wrote this: "The genetic centralization of food production is something to worry about. The stuff of national sustenance is involved, the sustaining essential ingredients of life, the most basic components of food making. These are the food determinants at the innermost sanctum of biology. Indeed, these are the ingredients of power. These genes that command the faculty of chloroplasts to bottle the sun, so we can have food. They are, in their workings, the closest of a kind to anything we dare call sacrosanct. We owe them more respect than to patent their trade. The health of our fields, the health of our plant communities, and the future of our food supply will depend on whether, as a global culture, we can learn to respect the whole of the biological community and to accept our role as citizens of it, and to honor those who still retain the connection. I like the example of clover. I went out today to inspect the autumn crops, those we will harvest into December: cauliflower, broccoli, kale, and collards, and those we will harvest for the winter share to be stored in the root cellar: turnips, radish, rutabaga, and carrots. In the adjacent field where we harvested wheat in July, the flowers of red clover dominate the green blanket that covers the silt loam. After the wheat harvest, I mowed the chaff that remained, and the clover, sown 2 years ago and at home in the shadow of the wheat, was stimulated by this increased access to the light. It is a beautiful plant. 3 heart-shaped leaves delicately streaked with a whitish V, and at the end of an 18-inch stem, hundreds of purple-red flower whorls holding the space for a seed. It is the tiniest seed we plant, hardly visible in the center of your palm, yet it is responsible for the most significant contribution to field fertility. Having germinated in the shade of the wheat, the delicate white flowers of campion, otherwise uncommon in our landscape, complete the natural bouquet of the field. Our culture, our habitation in this time on earth, is in need of transformation. Some say in the shape of a new story. Transformation comes from within, and seeds have mastered the art. Clover does not think about responsibility. Its response to altered circumstances is to give nourishment. I have sown the seeds of clover and seen it come to flower in the fields, and I have tasted the harvest of nutritious food the following season. May we continue to cultivate our fields with the imperishable mystery in mind, and to playfully, carefully follow these seeds and nurture them where they desire to go. So that's at the close of the book Seedtime. And before I move into the chapter that I want to read from my new book, which is called Soil and Spirit, I want to say something about how this actually occurred. This talk came about, which was that a connection with Josh Halsey and Tom, the director of the museum. I think it first came about through an email, and it happens to be about Epios Americana, the ground nut. The Sagaponic is named after the nut that grows in the ground. That's the Epios Americana, and we discovered this in our fields. It grows naturally and has grown here for who knows how many thousands of years. But of course, because of disturbance of development and large-scale agriculture, the ground nut has disappeared in many places. Anyhow, we started a whole discussion about this, and Tom can maybe say something about that if he's listening after I read. So it seemed natural that I should. That Tom and Josh came out to the little garden that I'm now tending in back of one of the fields at Quail Hill. They still let me putter around there, even though I graduated from the farm after 30 years, just 2 years ago. Anyhow, I'm going to read about that garden. So the book itself is actually made up of stories from my travels, and you won't get the sense of that from the section I'm reading to you, because this is really about a garden here in Amagansett. But one of the chapters in the book is about a trip to China that I took some years ago to attend a international conference of community-supported agriculture, which was an extraordinary event. And I never guessed that I would spend some time in China, but there we were with people from 28 different countries who were practicing a different model, but something very similar to one another. Community-supported agriculture, something I've been involved with for 3 decades. So another chapter takes us to New Mexico, where we take part in a wonderful ceremony of harvesting amaranth seeds, led by some amazing people from Guatemala. Another chapter takes us back to Cornwall, where we lived for many years, and out onto this incredible peninsula, another peninsula, but a very different one, and an ancient one. And another chapter actually is about a teacher that I had. I never imagined I would be able to actually write a chapter about him. Basil Bunting, a Northumbrian poet who just happened to be teaching at the University of Binghamton, Harper College, where I was, in the 70s, and Bunting has been a thread through my life for 50 years. So, and actually, there he is. If I move to the side, that's a sculpture of Basil Bunting against the window there, made by William King, my father-in-law, and it was actually Bill's last piece, that sculpture of Basil Bunting, and he presented it to me as a gift. So Basil is here looking over my shoulder. Okay, so now with that rambling introduction, I'm going to read to you from a chapter called The Remembered Earth. It begins with an epigraph from N. Scott Momaday, a wonderful indigenous writer. Once in his life, a man ought to concentrate his mind upon the remembered earth, I believe. He ought to give himself up to a particular landscape in his experience, to look at it from as many angles as he can, to wonder about it and to dwell upon it. He ought to imagine that he touches it with his hands at every season and listens to the sounds that are made upon it. He ought to imagine the creatures there and all the faintest motions of the wind. He ought to recollect the glare of noon and all the colors of the dawn and dusk. Dusk, the swallow's hour, and a bright moon rises in the east over the North Atlantic. The ocean is near, I hear it, just there beyond the railroad tracks in Amagansett village, a short glide for an osprey, though I cannot see it from my sheltered garden tucked into the back of a Long Island farm field. I am surrounded on every side by robust maples, white pines, an elegant larch, a thick tangle of bittersweet, honeysuckle, and the rampant porcelain berry, as I kneel on the sweet-smelling earth, planting beans as the light fades. The varieties of Phaseolus vulgaris are rare, collected by seed travelers from distant places, and I am a willing and joyful conservator. New Mexico, Tuscarora bread, raffiofi, purple stardust, flor de Juno silvio. As the first star appears below the moon, fireflies rise among the grasses, flickering like earthly stars, on familiar terms with this soil. Swallows dip off toward night, and I press the last of the varietals one by one neatly into the row. This silt loam remembers the moment, as do I, as the last of the seed, nightfall, fills the furrow. Flash, a firefly, as the living seed too remembers the silt. So the actual seed I was planting was indeed named Nightfall, at Nightfall. When Ernst and Katrina approached me, they were desperate. Flower growers on rented land, they had just been given 2 weeks to vacate their garden, perennials primarily, planted in a sagaponic field. They heard word of our community farm. Did we have space, a fallow field perhaps, a place to park the plants, if only for a growing season? I sensed they were good growers. Their first concern was for the plants. Salt of the earth, I thought, an intuition that proved to be accurate. We've nurtured these plants from seed to flower. We can't abandon them now, Ernst said. At the time, we were bringing new fields into production season by season as our farm membership expanded, though we had yet to cultivate a fallow field to the south that borders the railroad tracks. You're in luck, I replied. There is an acre waiting for you in the back field within listening distance to the ocean. The lease of 1 acre expanded to 2 within a year, and our relationship, reciprocal from the start, matured with the plants. I supplied tractor work and compost. They offered labor in exchange and a more delicate horticultural understanding and practice. We learned from one another, and the example of a garden surrounded, embraced by a farm created a firmer, fuller experience. Our annual crop fields expanded to border the garden to the north and south. Like the soil we tended and the plants we cultivated, our human connection was symbiotic, and our shared attention to the specific silk loam continued to ripen. As a protection from the cold north wind and the storm gusts and salt spray from the southwest, and for a gardener's privacy, Ernst and Katrina transplanted the maples and pines that now sheltered the garden I tend. They spaded in a sapling in the southeast corner that today, 40 feet in height, extends sweeping boughs to dance in the daily winds and serves as a perch for mourning doves, red-winged blackbirds, cardinals, and the sharp-shinned hawk. This larch, Larix lyricina, stands alone, the only one of its kind within a wide radius. Not common to this Turtle Island, larch is dominant in the boreal forests of Canada and Siberia. It knows how to endure, as some trees in the forests of British Columbia have done for close to 2,000 years. Larch is also known as tamarack, a well-chosen Algonquian word for a Nordic species. It means wood used for snowshoes. Larix has inspired legends elsewhere in the world. In a Siberian creation story, God first chose to make 2 trees, a fir and a larch, female and male. In larch forest of the Alps, kindly spirit beings, the Salingen, known as the Blessed Ones, sing among the old growth larch. Here, so near to the Atlantic, it is the spirit from the sea that whispers through the long boughs. A lovely Greek word for whisper translates into English as scythorism, the sound of wind in the trees, scythorism, and I hear it through the larch. One day, Ernst summoned me to witness the results of a month-long project. We're getting to the Epios Americana. He gestured at 4 50-gallon garbage bins overflowing with odd-shaped earthy tubers. Now every farmer or gardener has a thick journal and memory full of stories that relate to undesired plant life. Plants that somehow thrive and persist in a crop field or a garden of perennials. Shall I speak again of my acquaintance with various invaders? Nutsedge, dock, galanzoga, purslane, delicious on a plate. Jimson weed, bindweed, mile a minute, mumweed. My OED, Oxford English Dictionary, lists a weed as a wild herb springing where it is not wanted. The sing-song effect of that phrasing would not satisfy many serious growers, nor did the long vines capable of growing 20 feet in a year, twirling out from those tubers impress our flower growers. Had I known at the time the history indigenous to this ground of Epios Americana, our discussion would have been prolonged. Ernst and Katrina were ace gardeners, careful and attentive to a seasonal market. They made their living selling flowers, and a weed that thrived on the support of healthy cultivars must be rooted out. They were thorough beyond imagining. Out of an acre of prime soil, 200 gallons of groundnuts. Sagaponack, a village just to the west of Amagansett, derives its name from Epios Americana, nut that grows in the ground, once a staple food for indigenous peoples. It is known by other names as well: wild bean, Indian potato, potato bean, hodoyamo, cinnamon vine, and groundnut, though the sweet melodic Lenape word hopness captures the wild spirit of Epios, which is Greek for pear. The Wampanoags taught early settlers how to harvest and cook groundnuts, and Thoreau wrote about his own foraging. He said, "In case of a famine, I should soon resort to these roots." They are leguminous in the family of peas with attractive maroon and white flowers. Pea-like in appearance, though hardier with an acrid smell, in my humble opinion. In botanical terms, the tubers are not roots, but rhizomatous stems. Like other legumes, the threads of the rhizome interact with bacteria that inhabit the soil. Bacteria is adept at capturing nitrogen. The Epios root stems provide a surface for nodules to fix, and the overall soil health is improved. Nearby trees gladly accept nitrogen in exchange for carbohydrates they exude in a process handsomely titled mutualism, a brand of symbiosis. Groundnuts reproduce along the thin rhizome like beads on a necklace. Native to many soils and naturally abundant, like other tubers, they sweeten as the ground turns colder. Though quite high in protein content, 17%, triple that of potatoes, and rich in isoflavone genistein, is my best pronunciation, an anti-carcinogenic compound, Epios long ago fell out of favor. Attempts to introduce the tuber to Germany, France, and Ireland during the potato famine over a century ago did not succeed. In the 1980s, a professor at Louisiana State University devised trials hoping to domesticate the groundnut to increase tuber size and yield. He claimed that domestication of the golden nugget would be a benefit to mankind. After a decade of improvements and promising crops, funding slipped away, the Epios Tribune ceased to be published, and a dedicated professor moved on. Perhaps there is something in this humble tuber that rejects popular approval and a place in the produce section of supermarkets. Enrique Samon relates a story of the indigenous Creek nation. An unknown band of people arrived in Creek territory, and the two groups lived in peace. Eventually, members intermarried, and some confusion followed. How to include those children born into existing Creek clans? The solution required naming a new clan to assure kinship among the people. The chosen name, White Potato Clan, Groundnut. After Ernst and Regina departed for a farm of their own, this garden passed through several transformations and changes of name. Regina, a German by birth, was fond of garden gnomes, and a population had moved in to commune with iris and dianthus, dahlia and narcissus. The name of the garden reflected the cultivator's taste, the gnomer's garden. Grant, with his beehives, followed the flower growers, and Apios mellifera provided a title, the bee garden. Mary of Bee's Knees, queen of beekeepers, settled into the bee garden, and her hives thrived. When Mary shifted her bees to a nearby field, we expanded our Chinese medicinal plantings into the herb garden. Now the groundnut had a place to revive, with bees as near neighbors. Our flower growers were indeed weeders without compare, though Epios, native to the soil, found a way to survive. Could we ask more of a traditional food source? Okay, so that's a lot about Epios. I'm going to now move to the end of that chapter. And pick up with another story that has to do with a bean. And at this point, it's a Chinnacock bean, and so that's going to finish this chapter. But I want to acknowledge that this is the ancestral land of the Chinnacocks and the Montaukett and the the other tribes, 17 total, who lived on this land for thousands of years. So I just want to acknowledge that. Okay. It is autumn, and I am harvesting the seeds of Anamarena, a plant I am strangely drawn to despite its far from showy, somewhat odd appearance, and of Scrofularia, or figwort, a compact bush that produces tiny red-brown flowers that rival angelica, and attracting pollinators, especially bumblebees, 5 times the size of the flower. For the bee to gather nectar requires dedication and dexterity of wings and abdomen. 32 years ago, seated on a 1952 Massey Harris tractor, I seeded a cover crop of rye across this 20-acre farm field to bring it into production. Today, in the herb garden that nests between fields of squash and potatoes, I am harvesting a diversity of seeds, seeds that have served a diversity of cultures. The means of transport and tillage is simplified, the soil is improved after decades of regenerative farming practice based on traditional indigenous methods. The messages are received from maple, larch, Queen Anne's lace, blackberry lily, balloon flowers, still blooming. Silt loam and the southwest wind are more nuanced, layered lightly. I've improved too, as a listener. Among the rare beans I harvest, now that the dried pods crackle, is the cranberry-colored Chinnacock bean, a variety above all others that belongs here. Several years ago at an organic farming conference in Syracuse, New York, on the land of the Haudenosaunee, I visited the display table of a champion seed saver, Lisa Bludnick, known for her generosity and for maintaining a collection of 1,000 bean varieties. I like the look of this one, I said. What is the history? Lisa, that is the Chinnacock bean, and I was given it by a seed saver from Kentucky. Surprised, engaged, I continued, I'm a neighbor of the Shinnecock Nation. My children attended school with Shinnecock children, and I gardened with the keeper of their seeds. Will you trust me with them? They are yours, she said. I returned to Long Island with a small packet and called Shane at his home on the reservation. This is Shane Weeks. His immediate question, are they cranberry colored? Yes. I've heard about those beans and I have been searching for years, Shane replied, spirited. The Shinnecock beans have been on a journey. Lisa was given them by a well-known third-generation seed saver, a Cherokee ethnobotanist from Wildwood Farm in Artemis, Kentucky, Chris Hubbard. The story is, Chris's grandfather was given beans by a fisherman from Long Island, and their name reports the provenance. Grown out for years at Wildwood Farm and by Lisa at Bludnick Farm in the Susquehanna River Valley, and by yours truly, the cranberry beans, after an exodus of 100 years, have now returned to their home ground. The variety and coloration reflects the years of travel, the various gardens. The round beans vary from deep cranberry to light rose to white, artfully streaked with red, whether grown in Shinnecock soil or in Amagansett silt loam. When I shuck them, the story shimmers out. Rare varieties of beans, a cranberry bean that journeyed forth a century ago from the Shinnecock Reservation and is now rematriated, an indigenous groundnut that twines where it will, Asian plants transplanted to North Atlantic island soil. A folly, some would say, and I might agree. In fact, I will soon introduce you to another folly in another chapter, and a near neighbor with a mission that rhymes with my soil journey. I recall a passage from the writer Donald Culross Peattie. The fabric is whole and strong, the web is intricate to unravel. We are ourselves part of it. These vital partnerships, these symbioses are crossed threads in the web that go back to plant life's beginnings. So this is the close of the chapter. And remember that I began at dusk. Dawn, almost. Though a waning crescent moon rises in the east, just preceding the sun, over the tangled hedge, over the tallest reach of the larch. The sky an ocean of light like a tide returning. To the south, a thin river of mist caps the newly seeded field of rye. Here in the garden, within the net of moon, ocean, earth, every living thing reflects like a jewel. The auburn tips of Timothy grass, the three-pointed leaves of liquid amber, the red clusters of Sichuan pepper, the vines of Epios intertwined on young conifers. All that is flooded with dew flickers in the early light. There is something in the flight of the sparrowhawk, in her quick fall from the hedgerow to a light on silt loam, something familiar, remembered, just so as daylight fills the ferns. So that's my reading. That's from Soil and Spirit. I'm working on it, getting near the close, in a wonderful stage of trying to bring all the threads together. Now I'd like to open it up. Anybody has any questions? We can talk about the groundnut or the larch tree or anything you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. That was fantastic. I could definitely listen to you talk about plants and seeds and gardening for as much time as there is. I would suggest an audiobook if possible. That'd be perfect to put on to fall asleep to. Very calming.
My wife has been suggesting that for about 5 years or more, so she will be happy that you've said that.
You got a good voice for it.
Thank you.
So I'll see if anybody has any questions, comments, concerns, anything you want to say, please submit it in the Q&A function or in the chat, and I'll read those out to Scott, and we'll see what he has to say. But I will also say my director, Tom, texted me, and he said to Scott, a friend of our museum is developing the seeds you gave us in her greenhouse. I'll let you know how they are doing. Many thanks for your donation.
That's wonderful.
And what were the seeds that you donated over?
Well, it was the Epios Americana, and actually, it's not really a seed; it's a rhizome root, and you know where it is by the twining pea-like vine that can grow up to 20 feet, and so you have to dig down and you find the nut, the actual ground nut, which could be the size of a pea up to the size of a small potato. And they, it was astonishing that these gardeners had, I thought, eliminated them from that ground. I wish I'd known more about it at the time. This was many years ago, but they didn't. And those nuts are still there, and they probably survive all over the South Fork on lawns underneath. And they love to twine up other plants. There's this symbiotic relationship between them and the trees that I planted there. And that's how I discovered them again.
For those watching here, I have a picture of one of these that you can see here.
There you go.
So everybody can get a good idea of these. I know it doesn't show the scale, but I believe Tom brought in a bunch of samples for us to check out at the museum. And they're like almost like the size of an egg, I would say.
Yeah.
Like a small egg.
Yeah. Well, the fellow in Kentucky who, was working on a project trying to domesticate it, basically, grew some the size of potatoes, of large potatoes, but for whatever reason, they haven't made it onto supermarket shelves, and that's a good thing in my mind.
Yeah, and doing a little bit of research about them myself, I found that apparently in Japan, it's become a big part of their diet there, and it's actually domestically farmed in some of the prefectures there.
Yeah. I've heard that. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
So let's see if anybody has questions. Again, send them along. We have a few here that I'll start reading through now. A little long of a question here, but I'll start reading it. It is an honor to see you and to hear you read from your work. I had the great fortune to come across your work in the 1990s and cited you. You spoke of redefining the relationship between the producer and the consumer, counteracting the pressures of the market and providing the producer with a degree of security and the consumer with access to affordable quality produce. My question, Are you / is Quail Hill working with community gardens in New York City? I know you provided advice on CSAs and other matters. Could you talk about that?
That's a good question. We Quail Hill Farm is in good hands, still going well. 30, well, it'd be going into the 33rd year now. And over the years, we've actually worked with gardens and gardeners in many, many places, some in New York, but the project that comes to mind immediately is we worked with a woman from the nutrition department at Stony Brook, and we helped create 10 gardens in low income areas on Long Island in Suffolk County. This was some years ago. And that was a really successful program. And right now, Quail Hill Farm is doing a wonderful program of working, of supplying fresh produce throughout the entire growing season to the Bridgehampton Child Care Center. And a lot of people have come together to allow that to transpire. And it's a wonderful program going into, I think, the 3rd year now. So there have been many, many different partnerships over the years. And that's really what community supported agriculture is about. So I hope that goes some way to answering that question.
And somebody was asking, where can one purchase this produce?
We'll go through the Peconic Land Trust website and look under Quail Hill Farm. And I think now is the time where you want to take a share in the farm. The farm does sell at the Sag Harbor Farmers Market on Saturdays. That runs throughout the season as well. But the way community supported agriculture works is that you buy a share in the farm and you actually come at Quail Hill to harvest your own food in the field.
And the Peconic Land Trust website is peconiclandtrust.org if anybody wants to go check that out. And yeah, you get to have
Megan may be putting that in the chat.
Yeah, probably. And anybody, I think it'd be fun to go and actually pick it yourselves too. See, somebody else was asking. So for the groundnut that we were talking about, the Epios Americana, how many vines do you need to get a serving of the nuts, would you say? Is it like one per vine, or are there a couple on there?
Yeah, no, there's a few in each vine. There can be a number, probably up to, well, I don't know, could be anywhere from 1 to 10, something like that. But they do need some time to mature. So you can leave them in the ground, and the next year, that tuber will go back to the earth basically, but the roots of the vine the rhizome will produce more tubers in the following year. So it's better to leave them undisturbed for a while. But this is one of the things about domesticating them. You would need quite a few to, produce the kind of quantity that you get from potatoes.
And outside of the ground level, on the vine, does it flower at all? Something that makes it very
it's a
noticeable?
Beautiful flower, gorgeous flower. Yeah, it's sort of maroon and white, streaked, and it looks like, if people know what a pea flower, it looks exactly like that. It has what I think is a terrible smell, but other people may not agree with that. But the flower is gorgeous.
That's great. Let's see, another question from my director, asking if you've noticed any effects of climate change over at Quail Hill Farm.
Yeah, people, when I was in all the years I was there, basically the farm members would come, and I was supposed to be the one with the most knowledge about the weather, and I basically throw up my hands and say, well, we'll see what the next day brings. But gradually, over certainly the last 10 years or so, the major factor was how erratic the weather is, and obviously people have
Mhm.
noticed that, and that's one of the major impacts of climate change. And so, yeah, it makes it so much harder as a grower or a plant person to deal with erratic weather. But the other major factor I noted about was the length of the season. So that, for instance, traditionally we wanted to get the potatoes out of the ground before in November, early November, and certainly before Thanksgiving. But in the last years that I was there, so this is going back 5 years or more, we dug potatoes in December,
Hmm.
and so there's a very obvious change right there. Yeah.
Somebody else is asking, when will we be able to buy a copy of Soil and Spirit?
Oh, I wish I could tell you, and I have to. I actually had a wonderful conversation with my editor. So Milkweed is a really wonderful publisher. I encourage everybody to look them up. They're not-for-profit publisher based in Minneapolis. They've been around for 40 years, and they've had tremendous success in the last couple of years with a really beautiful book called Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I talk about her in my book. Anyhow, I encourage you to look up Milkweed and who they publish and everything. Well, I had a wonderful discussion with Daniel, but it's not 2022. It's going to be 2023. So it's going to be a year, but it's coming. That's the
Well,
best I can do.
it'll definitely be worth the wait.
Thank you.
And someone's asking, how did Quail Hill Farm start?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Well, so we're the first CSA in New York State, and it started because this, seed of an idea of community supported agriculture was, or how can I give you a short answer to this? I'll try and make this as short as I can. Brought this idea from Switzerland. The idea was picked up at 2 farms in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Then the idea was picked up here by a fellow named Hugh Williams, who used to grow fruit next to where the Hayground school is now. Those trees no longer exist, but he was a biodynamic grower, and CSAs started on biodynamic farms in this country. And so 10 families got together to, with Hugh Williams on an acre of land or something like that, to grow some vegetables and to experiment with this thing called CSA. It wasn't until 2 years later that it needed a new home, a more secure home. And right at that moment, Deborah Light had donated the first 20 acres to the Peconic Land Trust. John Halsey, who had never heard of community support agriculture, welcomed the idea of this interesting concept, and that started Quail Hill Farm in 1990 in Amagansett. I should say that among those 10 families was my mother-in-law, who's now 96 and is still a member of Quail Hill Farm, and Bill King, the sculptor who was married to Connie Fox. And Bill invited me to a Saturday meeting of this new thing called community supported agriculture, and I wound up attending that meeting for 30 years.
Wow. Yeah, and there's if you go to the Peconic Land Trust website, they have a page dedicated to Quail Hill Farm, and on there's a great short video as well talking about the history of Quail Hill Farm and what all you have going on there. I was watching that the other day in preparation for today's talk. And yeah, it looks beautiful over there. And I definitely encourage everybody, if you haven't already, to take a chance to go by there. Maybe in the summer, might be a little not as lush right now in the winter season, right?
Well, the springtime, when the red-winged blackbirds return in March, is a wonderful time, because it just wakes up there, and the red-winged blackbirds wake the whole place up. It's really a wonderful time to go. I should mention, I don't think I mentioned the title of This Common Ground, which was the book I wrote before Seedtime, and that book really tells the story of Quail Hill Farm. This Common Ground, it's called.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, so if I think that might be all of the questions that we had come in for today. So I would definitely encourage everybody to head on over to Scott's website, um, check out all of his previous books, keep an eye out for his forthcoming books. And I want to thank everybody for joining us here today. Make sure to go to southamptonhistory.org to check out all of our future programs that we have going on. And Scott, thank you again.
Thank you all for listening, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, everybody, and have a good rest of your day.